Hey everyone, today I'm going to go over spell changes for Prot Warriors and Cataclysm. First, let's look at rotational changes. Probably the biggest changes here are for Heroic Strike and Cleave. Both of these abilities now have a 3-second cooldown and higher rage cost, but they're also instant attacks off the GCD instead of being on next hit abilities. Both are still rage dump abilities, but it's easier to actually dump rage with them now. You cannot just macro them into everything and never get rage starved like in Wrath. If you find you have excess rage even when pressing Heroic Strike or Cleave on CD, there's also a new spell, Inner Rage, that has a 30-second cooldown and reduces the cooldown of Heroic Strike and Cleave by 50% for 15 seconds. This brings their cooldown to 1.5 seconds and allows you to get off twice as many casts as long as you have rage to accommodate it. So you basically have two levels of rage dumping: normal Heroic Strike and Cleave spam, and Inner Rage Heroic Strike and Cleave spam. Shield spam now scales off attack power instead of block value, since the block value stat no longer exists. Blocks are now a 30% damage reduction and 31% with the meta gem. Crit block, which is gained from Mastery, Hold the Line, and Shield block, will double this amount to 60 and 62% respectively. Crit block is a separate secondary roll once the outcome of an attack has already been determined to be a block, so it does not add to combat table coverage. Check out my combat table coverage and Cataclysm video if you want more information. Rend now does a bit more damage and is used in both our single target and AoE rotations. For AoE, it actually becomes our top priority due to the new Blood and Thunder talent that causes Thunderclap to apply Rend to every target it hits if Rend was already on one of the targets. Devastate now only stacks under up to 3 instead of 5. There's only one armor debuff type now, 12% armor reduction, so the Sunder change is just the new norm. Thunderclap doesn't change itself, but in addition to the Blood and Thunder talent we just talked about, there's another new one, Thunderstruck, that causes Thunderclap to give you a buff that stacks up to 3 and increases your next shockwave's damage by 10% per stack. Demoralizing Shout now decreases physical damage by 10% instead of reducing attack power. The reduced attack power debuff type no longer exists, so this is just the replacement for it. The range is still 10 yards by default, but I couldn't find any tooltips that didn't say 0-yard range on them for some reason. Colossus Smash is a new ability that deals damage and allows you to bypass 100% of the target's armor for 6 seconds. It has a 20-second cooldown and is only usable in Battle Stance and Berserker Stance. While not currently tanking, this is a solid damage boost. You could also potentially use it while tanking. Just keep in mind you'll briefly lose innate crit immunity, any rage you have over 25, and some damage reduction. You will likely have full combat table coverage with shield block up, and later you'll just have it passively. So even though you may lose your innate crit immunity briefly when you leave defensive stance, you may still be uncrittable through full combat table coverage. Now let's look at cooldowns. Rallying Cry is a new ability all warriors get that is basically a raid-wide last stand. It has a 3-minute cooldown and increases max HP of raid members within 30 yards by 20% for 10 seconds. This is a great raid defensive, and the raid damage in Cata dungeons and raids gives you plenty of opportunities to use it. Last Stand doesn't change baseline, but there's no longer a glyph to reduce its cooldown, so it'll always be 3 minutes. Unfortunately, Last Stand shares a cooldown with Rallying Cry, so you're forced to choose between your raid defensive or a better personal defensive. This is something I hope they'll change in Cataclysm. Shield Block now works a bit differently. It costs 10 rage, but has a 30-second cooldown when talented, and increases block chance by 25%. Even early on in Kata, this 25% will be enough to get you full combat table coverage. The new component to it is that any block chance that takes you over full combat table coverage will convert to crit block chance. So this eventually will become up to a plus 25% crit block chance CD once you have more gear. Due to the Shield Mastery talent, Shield Block will also reduce magic damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds. Recklessness, Retaliation, and Shield Wall are now usable in any stance. Shield Wall has been changed to a 40% damage reduction baseline, and there's a talent you'll always pick up that lowers the CD by 3 minutes, in addition to some other great effects, bringing it down to 2 minutes. And the glyph now makes it a 4-minute cooldown with a 60% damage reduction. It's basically the reverse of how it was in Wrath. Recklessness now increases special attack crit by 50%. Heroic Leap is a new ability warriors get that allows you to jump anywhere between 8 to 40 yards away. This has a 1-minute cooldown and does some AoE damage at the landing area. Heroic Leap is one of the most fun abilities ever added to the game, and it's of course really useful too. Heroic Throw doesn't change baseline other than doing more damage, but there's now a talent to reduce its cooldown to 30 seconds, and a glyph that makes it apply a stack of Sunder. Intercept now only stuns for 1.5 seconds instead of 3. There is a new major glyph that adds 1 second to the stun, making it 2.5 seconds. Intervene no longer has a minimum range, only a maximum range. Spell Reflection now has a 25-second cooldown, up from 10. There's a new talent that gives you up to 60 rage when you reflect a spell. Blood Rage no longer exists. Pummel is now usable in any stance, and Shield Bash no longer exists. Let's look at changes to stances. First off, the Stance Mastery passive has been increased from 10 rage to 25, so by default, stance swapping is less painful than before. Defensive stance no longer reduces your damage done by 5%. Its threat modifier has also been buffed through the roof to a whopping 500% threat generation, which is the same threat increase all tanks get in their tank stance now. Due to the Bastion of Defense talent, you'll also get minus 6% chance to be crit while in D-stance. The defense stat no longer exists, so all tanks now get crit immunity through a similar talent. Battle Stance no longer increases armor pen, but instead increases damage done by 5% and reduces damage taken by 5%. Berserker Stance no longer increases crit chance and damage taken, it increases damage done by 10%. Now we'll go over some miscellaneous changes. Let's go over the biggest one first, Vengeance. This is a new mechanic all tanks have that gives a stacking attack power buff based on damage taken. You'll typically get 5% of damage taken as attack power, but the first melee you take will grant 33% of damage taken as attack power, and your Vengeance will never drop below 33% of the damage you've taken in the last 2 seconds. The cap for this attack power bonus is your stamina plus 10% of base HP. In this blue post, Blizzard notes that they intentionally made the tooltip wrong because it's shorter and most people would not notice. Vengeance is one of the most fun parts about playing a tank in Cata because you get to do way more damage. Battle and Commanding Shout have changed a bit. Commanding Shout is now part of the stamina buff type, and the increased health buff type no longer exists. This buff can be brought by a priest through Power Word Fortitude, warlocks through their Imps Blood Pact, and Beast Mastery hunters through a Silithid pet's Karaji Fortitude. Battle Shout is now part of the strength and agility buff type instead of the static attack power buff type, since the static attack power buff type no longer exists. This buff type is also brought by DKs through Horn of Winter, Shamans through Strength of Earth Totem, and Hunters through a cat pet's Roar of Courage. Both Battle Shout and Commanding Shout no longer cost rage, but they now have a 1-minute cooldown. Taunts can no longer miss, just like all taunts in Cata. Victory Rush can now be used in any stance and heals you for 20% of your max HP. There's also a major glyph that increases the healing by 50%, and the Impending Victory talent gives Devastate a chance when used on targets below 20% HP to make Victory Rush usable, but it will only heal for 5% of max HP. Vigilance has been reworked a bit. It now gives you Vengeance as if 20% of the target's damage taken was done to you and no longer has any threat transfer component. It also no longer reduces damage taken by the target since the 3% damage reduction buff type no longer exists. You will still be able to machine gun taunt with it though. That should cover everything. If you want to support me, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.